Hello, me dearios, and quite why I'm speaking to you in a full West Country accent, I'm not entirely sure, because today we're actually going to be talking about an Italian deck. And here we go with an attempt at an Italian accent. This is the Tarocchi Delle Stelle, which is a tarot deck, obviously from Italy. Not obvious from my accent, but probably obvious from the name, which has been created, or was created, back in the 80s, I believe, by Georgio Tavaglione. And those of you who've been watching my videos recently will probably have noticed that in the background of a couple of videos on my wall is a poster, quite a famous poster about yoga. And to my great surprise and delight, I discovered after I got hold of this deck, which I've had for some time and have wanted to talk to you about for some time, the artist is the same. The artist who did the yoga poster also created this deck and other tarot decks as well, but this is the one I think probably is most interesting, certainly from my point of view. If I remember to do it, what I'll do probably around about now is a cutaway to that yoga poster so you can see what I'm talking about. So I'm pausing here briefly just to see if I do actually remember to do it. And appearing as if by magic, the very poster of which I speak. And if you haven't seen a yoga poster by this point, then you'll know that I completely forgot to do it. But hopefully I have remembered and you've seen the yoga poster, and now you're going to see the deck. Now, the reason I'm doing this flip through is that I think this deck is absolutely gorgeous, but I haven't actually seen very much about it online. There are a couple of web pages, which I'll link down below, which give some information about the deck, but there's very little about the deck, very little in the way of reviews, very little in the way of YouTube videos that I've been able to find. So I thought it would be nice to just flip through this deck and give you an idea of what it's like. So first of all, first thing to say is that you get the little white book. Not so little, it's actually about 167 pages. Lots of information by the look of it. Strangely, the pictures in here are not actually pictures from the deck itself. But the information, I'm presuming, is very much from the deck. I don't know if it's available in English translation. I have not been able to find one, if there is one. But that's something I would like to track down because it looks as though it would be very interesting. Comes in a nice big box because it is a large deck. You can see from the size of my hand, which my hand is not huge, but my hand is, still larger than the average tarot card. This is a large deck. It's long cards, which leaves room for lots of detail, which is rather good. Here's the back of the cards, reversible back. Good card stock, not too flimsy, quite firm, not too glossy. Yeah, a nice card stock. These aren't actually cards from the deck. One of these cards is a card about information relating to the artist, Georgio Tavaglione. And the other card, excuse me, I'll just move all this stuff out of the way. The other card, is upside down, is an introductory card to Tarocchi Delle Stelle. And here we have this very glamorous lady who looks like she could be the High Priestess, but isn't actually the High Priestess from this deck. But she's there going, ta-da! Here is the Tarocchi Delle Stelle, and here are two people. Here are two people, either playing cards or reading the tarot and engaging with I Tarocchi Delle Stelle, the tarot of the stars. And that does give you a bit of a clue to some of the themes of this deck. It is a rather astrological deck, and you'll see what I mean in a second. Now, let me just see if it's worth zooming in a little bit. I don't want to zoom in so much that you lose the detail of the cards, but let's go through the majors, and I'll just give you, I think we could probably do two at a time actually, and that would be interesting for comparison's sake, and hopefully also would save you some time in watching this video. So yes, here we are with the Fool and the Magician. And the first thing to say is what you'll find in this deck is that although the pips have got very Rider-Waite-y meanings and some Rider-Waite-y imagery, and there is some Rider-Waite related imagery in the majors to my eye are much more akin to older and more traditional decks like Marseille. And in actual fact, the the system that's being followed here is less related to the Golden Dawn system and perhaps more related to that of the French occultists, so Eliphas Levi and so on. And this is the general format of the card. Certainly in the majors you see this zodiacal wheel, there's various symbols including Hebrew letters. You'll find, for example, that in the Fool and the Magician the Hebrew letters are not used in the same way that they are in the Golden Dawn system. I think they've transposed these Hebrew letters. I need to check which one's which, but I think you'll find that the usual Hebrew letter that is apportioned to the Fool is apportioned to the Magician here, etc. So very nice detailed artwork, very warm artwork I think in this deck. Kind of cartoonish, almost comic book like, but I love it. I think it's really nice art. I love that yoga poster and I love this deck. And we'll just quickly go through the majors so that you can see more of them. So here we have the High Priestess and the Empress. Again, you know, the High Priestess, although translated, and you have got the English translation in the corner there, Papessa I would translate as, you know, perhaps the female Pope, which again is more akin to the Marseille tradition, although you definitely see Rider-Waite allusions here with the two pillars. We have the Empress with the traditional shield, with the eagle on the shield, crown of stars, etc, etc. Nice borders. I mean, there are no borders, but there's white borders, and I actually quite like the white space in this deck. You could trim these cards, I suppose, if you wanted, especially if you wanted to lose the letters on the corners, but it would be tricky without also losing some of the artwork. And to be honest, I wouldn't find it necessary. The cards themselves are not necessarily that easy to handle because of their size, but to be honest, I don't mind that because the artwork is just so stunning. So I'm going to fairly quickly flip through these so that you feel free, of course, to pause the video if you want to have a look at any card more closely. You see, it's interesting with the Hermit, that kind of alchemical square that's in place there. Almost kind of a hint at ceremonial type magic, and different symbols in each of these major arcana. There's symbols on justice, which here is 8, of course, so the traditional arrangement of justice. Symbols on the face of justice. I don't know if you can see, let's just see if I can get that a bit closer, and I'm sure that the guidebook will say something about all of this. By the way, I should just say, if you are at all averse to nudity, I should have told you to look away before now because you've already seen some, but there is quite a lot of nudity in this deck. I don't have a problem with it, but it's worth being aware of if it's something that might distress you. So, Strength and the Wheel of Fortune, the Hanged Man and Death. Death, of course, not named. Again, very traditional. Temperance and the Devil. Tower and the Star. Moon, Sun. Judgment and the World. I'd love to see the World closer. I mean, it would be lovely to see these paintings in larger format, even though the cards themselves are large, because they're just so detailed and so intricate, and there's a lot of information encoded, I think, into these images. So those are the majors, and I think if we go through the trumps, perhaps again 2 at a time. So we'll start with the wands. Pardon me for nudging the camera. This is my second attempt at this video because I've got a very awkward tripod arrangement going on here, and it was even more awkward when I was doing it yesterday, and I ended up inadvertently, schoolboy error, filming this in portrait mode, which meant, of course, when I came to upload it, it was at a terrible angle. And although I did consider just uploading it anyway, because you could still see the cards, I thought, no, my viewers deserve better than this. So I'm redoing it, and hopefully I'm remembering to say all the clever things that I said yesterday. Now, let's just pause here for a second to say what we noticed straight away is that imagery that appeared in the trumps, which was the kind of zodiacal wheel, has now been replaced with this, well, what looks a bit like a kind of a dial. And on the dial you can see there are different zodiac symbols, and each card is associated with a different zodiac symbol. So here we have Taurus for the wands, and you'll also see that we're told which card in the traditional playing card deck this relates to. Ace of clubs, two of clubs, clubs being for wands, of course. And what you begin to see in these cards, many of them will be very familiar from Rider-Waite imagery, but it's worth looking, as well as what's in the foreground, to look at the background and see what's going on in there, because there can be quite a lot of things happening in the background. So, in fact, here is a prime example. So the 5, where we often see people jostling with 5 rods in a group, here we have this individual who looks a bit like a conquering hero of some sort, pointing ahead into the distance. Ambition is the name of the card, the keyword on the card. And you know, you see a flag flying, a banner, you see 2 people wrestling here, the rods are staking out a piece of ground. There's a lot of information, as well as what's presented at the front in the background. So these cards do repay careful study. 8 of Rods, Garden, very interesting. And then we get into the courts. So we have the Jack, or Page, Cavalier, or Knight, the Queen, and the King. And again, in the court card, some interesting symbolism. So, there we are with the rods. And now, moving on to the cups. Gorgeous colour. I love the colouring of the cups. Green colouring here. This is overall it's a very warm coloured deck, mainly oranges, reds, yellows, but the green and the blue that appears in the cup suit is really very appealing. Here's an interesting one, the card that relates usually to nostalgia, childhood and so on. Here we have the past, and we do see the child and we see the adult, but it's a two-faced, two-headed adult, so an individual adult torn between, or not torn between, but balanced between male, female, older, younger, looking in one direction, looking in another, looking down, looking up. So quite interesting polarities at work here. Gorgeous 10 of Cups. And on to the courts. Those are the cups. So, now we shall move on to the swords. And again, just to say, the dial, you'll have noticed, has moved. We're now at Scorpio, by the look of it. So this is a very astrological deck. I'd need to look into whether, where the attributions come from. I think they do come from the French occult tradition, and not necessarily the Golden Dawn tradition. So worth looking into. This card I think is very interesting. Of course, the Three of Swords in the Rider-Waite deck is considered by many to be a bit of a problem card, because threes, if you look at pip cards that are not illustrated, the Three of Swords doesn't necessarily have to mean heartbreak, which of course is what's suggested in the Rider-Waite tradition, and I know that many tarotists are feel somewhat limited by the Rider-Waite interpretation, because they point out that, you know, if threes relate to growth as they do numerologically, and swords relate to thought processes, mental activity, ideas, the mind, then the Three of Swords doesn't have to mean heartbreak. It can mean growth of new ideas. It can be new ways of thinking. And so I like the fact that in this card it's called Dispersion. And, you know, again, if you look in the background, there's a howling gale going on there. There's lots of things blowing around. And here we have these two people who are dispersing the clouds, or look as though they're dispersing the clouds. The clouds behind are being dispersed by the wind. They're piercing this heart. The blood's coming out of the heart and being blown away. To me, this says something about the dispersal of false thinking, false beliefs, the growth of something different. And that to me does chime with the Rider-Waite imagery. I've always felt that the Rider-Waite imagery is unusual in that the love heart shape is such a hackneyed, cliched representation of love. And I don't think the love heart appears anywhere else within the deck, even those cards that are more associated with love. So I've always thought that the piercing of the love heart was the piercing of something to some extent artificial. So the slaughtering of sacred cows. And I think that is brought forward in this card. That was a long diversion, wasn't it? We'll move swiftly on. Some more interesting ones here, of course. In this card, we don't just have the usual chap standing there thinking, aha, I've vanquished you and now I have all your swords. We have Medusa. So, loss. Quite a powerful card. And the Six of Swords I mentioned in my video to my VR to Fable's Den on 5 deep tarot questions, that the Six of Swords is a card I really like seeing in a reading, because it always to me hints at moving through difficulty. And here this card does relate to difficult way, but you see that it looks as though this person has come down through the path past all the swords, so has progressed through the difficult way, unless of course he's going backwards up the hill, but that seems highly unlikely. Hope and difficulty, shame and affliction, and again onto the courts. They're very interesting and Egyptian looking symbolism appearing in all of the court cards. So those are the swords, and finally we'll move on to coins. Some very traditional looking images here, and some that are a bit less so. Again, you can see we've moved on to a different part, I think Aquarius, different part of the zodiac. And there we have it. There we have Tarot of the Stars. A really lovely deck. I think deserves to be more widely known. Still available. It is possible to purchase this in Europe. I have read some reports that it's out of print, but that's not been my experience. I bought a new copy fairly recently, so I'll look up the link for where I purchased this and post that below as well. And I hope that if you do purchase this deck, you enjoy it as much as I have. Okay, back soon.